Trump's tariffs were still hitting Canadian steel when Luxembourg's Prime Minister Luc Frieden landed in Ottawa. 3 days of meetings with Mark Carney, and when they were done, Canada had secured something Washington cannot threaten, sanction, or tariff away. Luxembourg is the second largest investment fund center on the planet. $11.5 trillion in assets under management. German pension funds, French institutional investors, Scandinavian sovereign wealth funds, all of it flowing through one country smaller than Rhode Island. And that country just signed a formal financial sector policy dialogue with Canada, announced a joint defense financing initiative, committed to expanding bilateral trade in aerospace and advanced manufacturing, and invited Luxembourg's Grand Duke to visit Ottawa. This is not a symbolic handshake. This is Carney building the architecture of a Canada that does not need American permission to grow. Trump threatened economic destruction through 35% tariffs on Canadian goods. Carney answered with $11.5 trillion in European capital access. And there is nothing Washington can do about it. The investment decisions of German pension funds are not controlled by the White House. The allocation strategies of French institutional investors do not require American approval. The sovereign wealth deployments from Scandinavia are beyond Trump's jurisdiction. Luxembourg just plugged Canada directly into the distribution network for European capital. Every Canadian infrastructure project became investable by European pension funds. Every Canadian energy export became financeable by European institutional investors. Every Canadian critical minerals project became accessible to capital looking for alternatives to Chinese supply chains. This is not a bilateral trade deal. This is access to the entire European institutional investment ecosystem. And it happened while Trump's tariffs were supposed to be bringing Canada to its knees, forcing Ottawa to the negotiating table, desperate for relief. Instead, Carney spent the week hosting Luxembourg's Prime Minister. The week before that, he was in Beijing signing trade agreements Trump called hostile. 3 weeks before that, he stood at the World Economic Forum in Davos and delivered the speech that went viral across global financial centers. Trump called it globalist rhetoric, uninvited Carney from his inauguration. Carney appeared before cameras the next day and said he meant every word, told Trump directly, no walking back. Today, we're showing you why Luxembourg matters more than its size suggests, how $11.5 trillion in European assets just became accessible to Canadian markets, why this partnership is the direct result of Carney's Davos speech, how Luxembourg is one of 12 new economic partnerships Canada built in 6 months, and why Trump's tariff strategy accelerated the exact outcome it was designed to prevent. Canadian independence from American economic pressure. But before we dive into this story, if you appreciate in-depth analysis like this, hit that like button and subscribe to stay informed on the stories that truly matter. Let's start with what actually happened in Ottawa. Prime Minister Luc Frieden arrived for 3 days of meetings. Not a photo opportunity, not a brief courtesy call. 3 full days of structured negotiations between finance officials, defense ministers, and trade representatives from both governments. When they were done, Canada and Luxembourg announced 3 immediate concrete steps. First, the launch of the Canada-Luxembourg Financial Sector Policy Dialogue. Finance officials from both countries meeting regularly. Formal institutional collaboration on financial stability, sustainable finance, fintech innovation, and capital markets development. This is not aspirational language. This is a permanent channel connecting Canadian financial markets directly to Luxembourg's $11.5 trillion asset management infrastructure. Second, the McGill-Luxembourg Center for Finance. McGill University establishing a permanent academic presence in Luxembourg. Master of Management and Finance program running between Montreal and Luxembourg City. Canadian financial talent trained inside Europe's investment capital. Direct pipeline for Canadian expertise into Luxembourg's asset management industry. Students graduating with credentials recognized by European institutional investors, and practical experience working inside the ecosystem, where European capital pools before deployment. Third, Carney personally invited Luxembourg's Grand Duke, Henry, to visit Canada. This is not routine diplomacy, this is a royal diplomatic signal. The hereditary head of state of Europe's financial center formally welcomed into Canada's diplomatic orbit. Grand Duke visits are reserved for relationships that matter strategically. Carney extended that invitation personally during Frieden's visit. Luxembourg opened its embassy in Ottawa in 2025 for the first time in the country's history. That timing was deliberate. Carney's government built on it immediately. The embassy opening was the foundation. The Frieden visit was the acceleration. The Grand Duke invitation is the formalization. But here's the detail that reveals why Luxembourg specifically matters. Luxembourg in 2024 held $22.3 billion in foreign direct investment stock in Canada. That made Luxembourg one of Canada's largest foreign direct investors, despite being a country of 660,000 people. Merchandise trade between the two countries totaled $249.8 million. That relationship existed before Trump's tariffs. Carney's job this week was to make it exponentially larger. The $22.3 billion in existing investment is the visible piece. The $11.5 trillion in assets Luxembourg manages is the strategic target. Investment funds managed in Luxembourg do not belong to Luxembourg citizens. They belong to pension funds in Germany managing retirement savings for 83 million people. Insurance companies in France managing policies for 67 million. Sovereign wealth funds in Norway managing oil revenues for 5.5 million citizens. Institutional investors across the entire European Union managing capital for 450 million Europeans. Luxembourg is the administrative and regulatory hub where all of that capital pools before it moves. The country built the legal infrastructure, regulatory frameworks, and financial expertise to make European capital mobile. 700 investment funds operate out of one tiny country. European headquarters of Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, PayPal, and dozens of the world's largest corporations all route through Luxembourg for tax efficiency and regulatory clarity. Connecting Canada directly to Luxembourg means connecting to all of it. Every German pension fund manager assessing infrastructure investments now has institutional access to Canadian projects through the Financial Sector Policy Dialogue. Every French insurance company diversifying into energy assets now has regulatory clarity on Canadian opportunities. Every Scandinavian sovereign wealth fund looking for alternatives to Chinese critical mineral supply chains now has trained Canadian talent from the McGill-Luxembourg Center who understand both markets. Here's where it gets fascinating. Luxembourg alone is significant, but understanding why Carney targeted it specifically reveals the larger strategy. Luxembourg is not the destination. Luxembourg is the gateway. The $11.5 trillion in assets under management represents German pension funds saving for retirement. Those funds need stable, rule of law investment opportunities with reliable returns. Canada checks every box. French institutional investors diversifying from European concentration risk. Those investors need commodity-producing democracies with transparent regulatory frameworks. Canada delivers. Scandinavian sovereign wealth funds seeking alternatives to Chinese critical mineral supply chains. Those funds need mining jurisdictions with environmental standards and political stability. Canada qualifies. Luxembourg is where all of those institutional investors make allocation decisions. The Financial Sector Policy Dialogue gives them direct access to assess Canadian opportunities. This creates a fascinating dynamic. Trump imposed 35% tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and auto exports to pressure Canada economically. Those tariffs hurt. Canadian manufacturers face real costs. Workers in those sectors dealt with layoffs and reduced hours. But every month those tariffs stay in place is another month. Canadian companies build relationships with European buyers who do not care about Washington's preferences. Another month, Canadian infrastructure projects get connected to Luxembourg capital pools. Another month, the $11.5 trillion in European assets becomes more accessible to Canadian energy, mining, and manufacturing investments. German pension funds allocating capital to Canadian infrastructure do not need White House approval. French insurance companies investing in Canadian critical minerals are not subject to American veto. Norwegian sovereign wealth diversifying into Canadian energy assets operate under Oslo's priorities, not Washington's. Meanwhile, the United States faces a structural problem. Trump's tariff strategy created. Canada has resources the world needs. Potash for global agriculture. Critical minerals for electric vehicles and defense systems. Energy for European markets desperate to escape Russian dependence. Timber for construction. Grain for food security. Clean water when climate change makes it scarce. Those resources do not stop being valuable because Trump imposes tariffs. They become more valuable. Every tariff Canada faces from the United States makes Canadian exports to alternative markets more attractive by comparison. European buyers pay better than American buyers. Chinese buyers pay on time. Indian buyers are in a growth market. Brazilian buyers are building agricultural capacity. The global demand for what Canada produces is not controlled by the White House. The Luxembourg partnership did not happen in isolation. It was the direct result of what Carney built at Davos 3 weeks earlier. Carney stood at the World Economic Forum before Trump arrived and delivered the most consequential speech any Canadian leader has given on the international stage in a generation. He told the room, which contained the leaders of global finance, that the rules-based international order was partially fiction, that the strongest always exempted themselves when convenient, that middle powers had to act together or be consumed one by one. He did not name Trump. He did not need to. Every person in that room understood exactly who he was describing. The speech went viral, not because it was dramatic, but because it was analytically precise. Carney identified a structural reality about international power that every leader of a middle power nation recognized immediately. Trump heard the speech, called it globalist, uninvited Carney from the inauguration. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent went on television and claimed Carney was walking his comments back during a phone call with Trump. Carney appeared before cameras the next day and said the opposite. "I meant what I said. Told Trump directly. No walking back. No retreat. That combination transformed how foreign leaders viewed Canada." The intellectual credibility of the Davos speech, followed by the refusal to capitulate, showed that Canada was serious about building alternatives. Luxembourg came to Ottawa. India invited Carney to New Delhi. Brazil asked for an April visit. Australia confirmed Carney's address to Parliament in March. The Davos speech created the diplomatic momentum. The Luxembourg partnership converted it into capital. Luxembourg is one of 12 new economic and security partnerships Carney announced in the past 6 months. Each deserves attention because together they represent a systematic dismantling of Canada's dependence on the United States. China. Carney visited Beijing in January and reached a breakthrough agreement. Canada lowered tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% to 6.1%. China lowered tariffs on Canadian canola oil from 85% to 15%. Seafood, peas, and other agricultural products removed from Chinese retaliation lists. $7 billion in export markets unlocked for Canadian farmers, ranchers, and fish harvesters. Trump immediately threatened 100% retaliatory tariffs if Canada made a deal with China. Carney signed anyway, called it rectifying problems from recent years, entirely consistent with trade obligations. The message to Washington was clear: Canadian trade policy serves Canadian interests, not American preferences. European Union. Canada signed a new defense and security agreement with the EU and secured membership in SAFE, the Security Action for Europe initiative. 150 billion euros in European rearmament funding. Canadian defense companies gained expanded access to European procurement markets. European defense investment flowing into Canadian aerospace and advanced manufacturing. Carney instructed his personal representative to the EU to mobilize deeper CPTPP-EU economic integration. Significant that early progress delivered in 2026. The transatlantic defense relationship that excluded Canada for decades is now actively recruiting Canadian participation. United Arab Emirates. $70 billion investment agreement signed. Foreign Investment Protection Agreement formalized. Free trade negotiations launched. UAE Sovereign Wealth Capital. Wairatcht. Targeting Canadian energy infrastructure, technology sectors, and critical minerals projects. The Gulf states that historically viewed Canada as an American satellite now view Canada as an independent partner worth 7-figure sovereign investment commitments. India. Carney accepted invitation to the New Delhi AI Summit in March. Free trade negotiations resumed after years frozen under Trudeau. Relations thawed after Carney invited Indian Prime Minister Modi to the G7 Summit Canada will host later this year. India and the European Union just completed their own free trade agreement after nearly 2 decades of negotiations. Canada positioned to follow. The Indo-Pacific strategy that was aspirational under previous governments is now producing signed agreements and confirmed state visits. Brazil and Mercosur. Carney accelerated trade talks with the Mercosur bloc, including Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. Brazilian President Lula confirmed. Carney accepted an April visit invitation. Mercosur represents 250 million people and the world's largest agricultural exporting region. Canadian grain technology, potash fertilizers, and agricultural equipment now have access pathways to markets that compete with American exports. Australia. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese confirmed Carney will address Australian Parliament in March. No Canadian Prime Minister has visited Australia since 2014. Canada buying an Australian-designed radar system for Arctic deployment, defense and trade partnerships deepening simultaneously. The Five Eyes intelligence relationship expanding into economic coordination that bypasses Washington's approval. South Africa and the African continent. Carney attended the G20 in Johannesburg and launched discussions toward a foreign investment promotion and protection agreement. South Africa is Canada's largest trading partner on the continent. FinDev Canada opened a regional office in Cape Town. $318 million in development finance flowing to African infrastructure projects in 2025 alone. The continent China courted for a decade through Belt and Road is now receiving Canadian institutional investment as an alternative. The human cost of Trump's tariff strategy falls entirely on American consumers and American businesses locked into Canadian supply chains. The integrated North American auto industry crosses the border 6 to 8 times before a vehicle is finished. Assembly plants in Michigan depend on Canadian parts. Steel mills in Ontario supply American construction. Aluminum smelters in Quebec feed American aerospace. Trump's 35% tariffs disrupted all of that. But the disruption cuts both ways. American manufacturers cannot source Canadian aluminum at competitive prices anymore. That aluminum is now being sold to European buyers through Luxembourg facilitate investment in Canadian smelting capacity. American construction companies cannot import Canadian lumber at pre-tariff costs. That lumber is being redirected to Asian markets, where demand is growing and tariffs do not exist. American auto plants face parts shortages when Canadian suppliers redirect production to European assembly lines that do not penalize imports. While American supply chains face permanent restructuring costs from Trump's tariff decisions, Canadian industries that survived the initial pressure are now positioned better than they have been in decades. They have diversified customer bases. They have institutional investment access through Luxembourg's financial infrastructure. They have trade agreements with 12 new partners across 5 continents. And they have a prime minister who stood at Davos, described the structural problems of international power honestly, refused to walk it back when Trump complained, and built 12 partnerships while Washington assumed Canada would eventually cave. The endgame is clear. Canada is building an economic architecture that does not require American approval to grow. The 67% of Canadian exports currently going to the United States is the number Trump thinks gives him leverage. But that number has been declining since Carney took office. Every Luxembourg partnership, every China agreement, every Mercosur negotiation pushes it lower. Carney's stated goal is to double non-American exports over the next decade. Luxembourg is not an endpoint. It is an acceleration. The mathematics are not abstract. Canada exported roughly $700 billion worth of goods and services in 2024. 67% to the United States means approximately $469 billion. Carney's goal of doubling non-American exports means adding another $230 billion in non-American sales over the decade. That requires exactly the kind of institutional partnerships Luxembourg represents. Trump's tariff strategy was designed to isolate Canada economically, force Ottawa to accept American terms on dairy protections, digital services taxes, and trade with China. The theory was that economic pain would break Canadian political will, that Carney would arrive at the White House desperate for tariff relief. Instead, Carney arrived at the World Economic Forum before Trump and upstaged him on the global stage, flew to Beijing and signed agreements Trump called hostile. Welcomed Luxembourg's prime minister for 3 days and connected $11.5 trillion in European assets to Canadian markets. Built 12 partnerships across 5 continents, while maintaining that he will only sign a deal with the United States that is the right deal and a good deal for Canada. The structural reality Washington refuses to acknowledge is that threatening allies accelerates their independence. Economic pressure on Canada did not create submission. It created Davos speeches that went viral, Beijing agreements that unlocked $7 billion in export markets, Luxembourg financial partnerships that plug Canada into European institutional investment, 12 new economic relationships that make Canada permanently less dependent on Washington's approval, Every tariff Trump imposed gave Carney another reason to build alternatives. Every ultimatum Trump delivered gave foreign capitals another reason to work with Canada. The pressure that was supposed to force Canadian concessions instead produced Canadian partnerships that Washington cannot veto, sanction, or tariff away. Canada, meanwhile, builds infrastructure that serves Canadian interests first, strengthens global supply chain diversity second, and views trade relationships through the lens of reliability. A country that weaponizes tariffs against allies is a country that does not deserve preferential access to Canadian resources. Carney made that calculation without stating it directly. He built 12 partnerships. He connected to $11.5 trillion in the European capital. He doubled down on the Davos speech when Trump demanded he walk it back. And he maintained throughout that Canada is not waiting to survive, that Canada is building while it waits. The irony is perfect. Trump imposed tariffs to force Canadian submission. He accelerated Canadian independence instead. He thought 67% export dependence gave him leverage. He gave Carney 12 new partnerships that will reduce that number for the next 3 decades. He wanted Canada isolated and desperate. He made Canada the partner every middle power wants to work with because Canada demonstrated it will build alternatives when threatened. Luxembourg came to Ottawa. India invited Carney. Brazil confirmed the April visit. Australia scheduled the parliamentary address. The European Union expanded defense cooperation. The UAE committed $70 billion. China signed the canola agreement. All of it happened while Trump's tariffs were supposed to be bringing Canada to its knees. Canada paid no tariff relief to secure any of those partnerships. Canada made no concessions on dairy to access European capital. Canada walked back nothing from the Davos speech to get 12 new agreements signed. Trump applied maximum pressure. Carney built maximum alternatives. The pressure was supposed to force submission. It produced independence instead. That is not what winning a trade war looks like. That is what happens when leverage is chosen without understanding that the country you are pressuring has resources the entire world needs, and dozens of willing partners who don't care about Washington's preferences. Trump thought he could isolate Canada. He isolated American influence over Canadian trade policy instead. Carney walks into every negotiation with Washington, now backed by options Trump did not anticipate. $11.5 trillion in the Luxembourg-managed European capital, $7 billion in Chinese export railway markets, 150 billion euros in European defense procurement, $70 billion in UAE sovereign investment, 12 partnerships across 5 continents, and a prime minister who stood at Davos before Trump arrived, delivered a speech that resonated across every capital managing middle power vulnerability, refused to walk it back when confronted, and built the coalition he described while Trump assumed Canada would eventually submit. Canada wins, Trump loses, Luxembourg just pulled up a chair to the table, and Washington cannot do anything about it.